Okay, I was telling the group that was here a little earlier that I have a lot to cover, and I don't know if I have the skill to cover it. I do have a plan. So this week, we're going to talk about narrative, which is one of the major genres of the Bible. And next week, we're going to talk about poetry. And then the next week, we're kind of going to do case studies of those in different elements. And there's one other group that we'll talk about when we talk about this group, which is prose. We'll call it discourse material. So, have any of you seen Karate Kid, the first one?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly it. So when do we actually get to do karate, right? Well, it's a long time later. So I feel this really deeply. Every week when I come in here, I think, oh, we've been talking about the Bible, but we haven't been studying the Bible. And to me, it feels like wax on, wax off, in the sense of when are we going to get to it? Sometimes, there are things that you have to learn before you do something. Or if you want to, if you learn to play guitar, you learn to play guitar incorrectly or not as well as you could. I learned to play pretty casually as a youth pastor. Then you start hanging out with musicians and you realize that really, to be a better guitarist, your finger position needs to be the most uncomfortable thing ever. And you have to kind of relearn things. And you have to practice doing a lot of things that you don't want to do so that you can do the things you want to do. We're kind of in a place right now where we are doing some things that feel maybe to you kind of schoolish. They sometimes feel schoolish even to me. I do fear, if you've seen it, I'm going to make all these movie references today, Dead Poet Society. When they come to the classroom, read in Pritchard what poetry is, and the student starts reading poetry is on a scale, and you got to have meter and this and blah, blah, and then he's like, pull all of those things out of the book. Like, that's nothing. You're not entering in poetry at all by learning all of those things about poetry. And then they just start studying poetry itself. There's a reality to that, and I feel that. But I also know that it's good to know how poetry works, right? He would have to explain that at some point, even if it was through the stories themselves. So we're kind of doing the wax on, wax off, the schoolish part of things, and that's where we're at. So as a review, real quickly, remember we talked about culture because this is going to come up a lot. Come on in.
Morning.
Welcome.
It's kind of crowded this morning.
It's kind of strange to say because there's actually not that many. It's just it's COVID. It's crowded for COVID. You guys watch TV these days and see people sitting next to each other in movies and stuff, and like, God, they're sitting too close. We want to keep these things in our minds every time we study the scripture. Let this be in the background of your mind. That in biblical culture, you're dealing with a dyadic identity, which is an identity that is based in the other. That you always see yourself in relation to someone else. And that's the foundation of biblical identity. We're individualists, they are not. You can go back in one of our videos in the classroom, you can look at and kind of go into a little bit more detail. It's an honor-shame culture. So honor is a value where people want to be esteemed and have power and prestige, and honor is like money. Shame is a negative thing for men. It's a limited good society. They believe that everything does not exist in perpetual unendedness, including things that are intangible. People who come from cultures where tangible things are limited also believe that intangible things like love and grace and mercy and favor are limited as well. And it's a patron-client society, which means it's, I don't need to be crude about it, it's a kiss-up society. Everybody is answering to somebody else. You got to serve somebody, right? That's the way it works. And all of those things together are kind of a matrix for understanding biblical cultures. That's not to say that the Bible is always in agreement with these things. The prophets stand out in contrast to dyadic identity. The word of the Lord came to me. Paul says, in contrast to dyadic identity, while I was a sinner, Christ died for me. And that's not groupthink in that way. Welcome, good morning. And there's things where honor and shame are set aside. Jesus hangs out with the most shameful people, right? That's a contrast. So when you're reading the Bible, it's not a matter of just saying, these are the things that make up that culture, and we've got to see the Bible only through that way, but it's sometimes seeing it in the counter to that way. And certainly for grace and favor, it's not seen as a limited good in that society. So this is the schoolish part, biblical genre types. This is English 101 literature, right? How do you know the types of things that you're reading? And how do you know to read? We talked about this, I think, the first or second week a little bit. I don't read a letter from Kendra Horn or Stephanie Bice's office the same as I read a letter from my daughter, right? I mean, and nobody has to explain to me. I just know how to read that differently. When my daughter says, "I love you, Daddy," and if somebody who I don't know is trying to tell me something and says, "I love you," I automatically know to read, hopefully, know to read those differently. Right? The other thing is a textbook is not the same as reading a fiction novel. Even if I wouldn't read the book about Alexander Hamilton, Chernoff's book, I wouldn't read that the same way as I would read a history textbook. But we don't think, these are things we don't think about. We just kind of intuitively know how to read those differently. The Bible is a collection of books made up of different genres. The unfortunate things, I think what we've done is we've kind of lost the creative approach to the Bible. And we just kind of made it all bland. So it doesn't feel like it has much flavor. And a lot of times when I'm talking to people about reading the Bible, who are struggling reading the Bible, what I find is that they're bored with it, which is shocking to me because I'm not really bored with it. And so that's that kind of thing. It's like when you like a movie and somebody else doesn't like it. Well, how do you not like that movie? I think part of the issue is just this thing of we read the Bible differently. And so we don't allow ourselves to enter into it the way that we would other things. And so we're going to talk about how that works. There are three major large block genre types in the Bible. The biggest one is narrative and stories, and we're going to talk in more detail about that today. And the second one is poetry. In our society, people don't read poetry very much. Poetry's kind of been lost on us, except for songs. That's the poetry type of our culture. And then there's discourse prose, where it's like laws, just regular reports, and that type of thing, maybe an epistle, which doesn't fit in narrative story or poetry. Now the thing is those are the big block areas of types, but it's not like you're only going to pick up a book and it's only going to have one of those. So for example, you pick up the book of Exodus. Exodus is going to have narrative. That's where we learn about Moses, right? And the people of Israel coming out of Egypt. It's also going to have discourse in terms of law, a bunch of laws for a whole society. And it's also going to have poetry, like in the Song of Miriam. So it's all going to be a mix in there. Some books are more one type than the other. Some are solely one type. So if you read Psalms, those are all songs. Those are all poetry. Although there might be narrative material within that poetry. So it's kind of a matrix of it. So the Bible's made up of history, genealogies, biographies, songs and poems, law, wisdom, letters, apocalypse. And we can even break it down more if we want to. It's 66 books made of different types of genre forms with these overarching things. So, what? Oh, too fast. Oh, there we go. I'm trying to get through it. Too much to say, not enough time. When you're a preacher, preachers talk about this. The problem with preaching is that when you talk about theology, you're talking about everything. You're talking about Christology, you're talking about everything. Who has enough time to say everything in 20 minutes? Right? It's kind of a hard thing to do. So some people try. Yeah. Some are really good at it, actually. It's a honed skill for sure. It's a gift and a skill. All right, you ready to? Yeah. I can share. This is a Google spreadsheet, so I can share this on our classroom thing too. So this is the breakdown. 42% of the Bible is narrative, which means 42% of the Bible is basically, we're going to say stories, okay? Which is incredible. It's great. We like stories. People are natural. We cannot communicate without story. We engage best through story, okay? And just psychologically, human beings, we're wired for it. And then poetry makes up about 33%. 32% here in this case. And then the rest, the discourse material, the law, the letters, the other, makes up about 25%, the other section of the Bible. So pretty evenly divided, but definitely weighted towards narrative and story. So we're gonna watch some videos here from the guys at the Bible Project, because they're gonna say, this first video is, I think, like 5 minutes, and the next one's gonna be about 3 minutes. They say really quickly and visually things that I would want to say. If you haven't watched the Bible Project materials, if you're studying any book of the Bible and you want a quick, fun visual synopsis of a book, they do a really good job. And the guy who is the core of doing it is a real scholar. Like, he really knows things. So it's good.
What's it called,
The Bible Project.
The Bible is a collection of many books, telling one unified story from beginning to end. But all those books were written in different literary styles.
Yeah, think of it like walking into a bookstore where every aisle has a different kind of literature. There's history or poetry or nonfiction. And when you choose an aisle and pick up a book, you're going to have very different expectations, different things that you're looking for.
Right, they're all literature, but they communicate in really different ways.
Yes, and so the same thing is true for the Bible. If you don't pay attention to what style it's written in, you will miss out on the brilliance of each book.
So, what are the main types of literature in the Bible?
The first and foremost is narrative that makes up a whopping 43% of the Bible. After that is poetry, which is 33% of the Bible. And then there's what you could call prose discourse, which makes up the remaining 24%.
Nearly half the Bible is narrative.
Yes, and this is no accident. Stories are the most universal form of human communication. Our brains are actually hardwired to take in information from stories.
And stories are really enjoyable. Why is that?
Well, stories train us to make sense of the seemingly random events that happen in life by taking those events and then putting them in a sequence. And then together you can start to see the meaning and purpose of it all.
And what links this all together?
Well, good stories always have a character who wants something. And then through these characters, an author can explore life's big questions, like who are we, or what's really important in life. And a good story always involves some kind of conflict.
Some challenge to overcome, just like in our own lives.
And that forces us to think about our own challenges, why there's so much pain or disappointment in the world, and then what can we do about it? And stories usually end with some kind of resolution, giving us hope for our own stories.
Since these are Bible stories, are the characters showing me how I should live?
Yeah, that's not quite the point. Most Bible characters are deeply flawed. You should not be like them. But we are supposed to see ourselves in them, which helps us then see our lives and failures from a new perspective. And without even realizing it, these stories will start to mess with you and change how you see the world and other people and yourself.
Now, there are different types of narrative in the Bible.
Yeah, there's historical narrative, but also narrative parables, short biographical narratives like the 4 Gospels. We'll look at all these in later videos.
Okay, next up is poetry, which honestly, I don't read a lot of.
Yeah, you're like most people. But 1 out of every 3 chapters in the Bible is poetry.
Yeah, why so much poetry?
Well, poems mainly speak through dense, creative language, linking together images to help us envision the world differently. Poems use lots of metaphor to evoke your emotions and your imagination.
Lots of fancy language, but wouldn't it be easier just to tell me what I need to know?
Well, think about it. In life, we tend to form mental ruts, and we think in these familiar, well-worn paths that are very hard to get out of through logic or reasoning. But what good poetry does is force you off the familiar path into new territory.
Sneak.
And there's different types of poetry in the Bible. There's lots of types of songs or psalms. There's the reflective poetry of the wisdom books, and then the passionate resistance poetry of the prophets.
Okay, the last big literary type is called prose discourse, and it makes up 1/4 of the Bible.
Yeah, these are speeches, letters, or essays. And the focus here is building a sequence of ideas or thoughts into one linear argument that requires a logical response. Like, hey, have you thought about this thing? You should also consider how it connects to this other thing. And if you do, then you will see that this is the result. And in light of that conclusion, therefore, you should probably stop doing that one thing so that this other thing will be the outcome.
So you're persuading me with reason.
Yeah, discourse forces you to think logically and consistently and then do something about it. Biblical discourse is found in law collections, in wisdom literature, and the letters written by the apostles.
Okay, so each book of the Bible has one literary style.
No, actually, most books have a primary literary style, like narrative, for example. But then embedded in the narrative, you'll come across poems or parables or a collection of laws. Every biblical book is a unique combination of literary styles.
And to read that book well, I need to be familiar with each literary type how it works.
Yeah, so you know what to pay attention to and what questions you should ask. But before we look at each type, there's one more unifying feature of biblical literature that's really important and really cool, and that's what we'll explore next.
Okay, those guys do a great job. I noticed that they said everything that I said before, but really well.
Hey everybody, thanks for watching.
We're gonna watch one more, and that's 2 videos in a row, which is hard for Americans. We just have a hard time. Our attention spans are not what they used to
The
be.
Bible is a collection of many
This
books
is about
telling
kind of
one
reading the
unified
Bible
story from
overall.
beginning to end.
So,
But all those books were written in different literary
just
styles.
the same
Yeah,
video
think of
over
it
and
like
over.
walking into a bookstore.
Hang on.
So the Bible is a collection of books written in different literary styles, like narrative, poetry,
This is the next one.
and most of us are familiar with these kinds of literature.
Yeah, we all know a narrative when we see one, like The Hunger Games or The Great Gatsby.
And most people can recognize poetry, whether it's Walt Whitman or the songs of Bob Dylan.
And every day we're surrounded by prose and news articles or essays.
Now, all of these examples are modern American literature in that they came from this time period and this region of the world.
But there's also medieval English literature from another place in time, or ancient Greek writings from this place in time.
So each time period and culture produces its own unique kind of literature.
And in order to read the Bible well, we need to keep in mind that it comes from this part of the world and was produced in this basic period of time.
So what's unique about ancient Jewish literature?
Well, a key feature is that it lacks a lot of the details that modern readers have come to expect in stories and poems.
And this makes it seem really simple.
But actually, it's very sophisticated literature. Every detail that is given matters.
And that's great, but the lack of detail means the stories are often loaded with ambiguities. I mean, take one of the first stories, Adam and Eve in the garden. Where did this talking snake come from? And why did God allow him there? Why didn't Adam and Eve die on the spot like God said they would? And who's this offspring of the woman who will destroy the snake but is bitten by it?
Yeah, so many puzzles in this story. And some of these are questions that we have and that are not important to what the author is focusing on. But some of these ambiguities are intentional.
Intentional? Won't that lead to bad interpretations, people filling in the gaps with their own answers?
Well, that's a risk the biblical authors took in writing this way. We all tend to impose our own cultural assumptions onto the Bible, but they apparently thought the risk was worth it. These oddities are really invitations into an adventure of reading and discovery.
What do you mean?
Well, for example, the strange promise about the offspring of the woman crushing and being bitten by the snake. That word offspring is a clue to pay attention to genealogies, which, lo and behold, run all through the biblical narrative. They trace the lineage from Eve all the way to King David and his offspring. And in the New Testament, Jesus is connected to the offspring of this royal line. Now, when you read the prophets, Isaiah connected this king to the suffering servant who would die on behalf of his people. And then in the book of Revelation, there's this symbolic vision. And can you guess? It's about a woman and her offspring. It's Jesus and his followers who conquer the dragon by giving up their lives.
Yeah, so each part of the story there is loaded with ambiguities, but altogether it makes sense.
And this is the literary genius of the Bible. It forces you to keep reading and then interpret each part in light of the others.
This is feeling complicated. I don't know if I can do all that.
Well, you're actually not expected to notice all of this by yourself or all at once. This dense way of writing forces you to slow down and then read carefully, embarking on this interactive discovery process through the whole biblical narrative over a lifetime of reading and rereading.
Ah, okay. Meditation literature.
Yeah, in Psalm 1, we read about the ideal Bible reader. It's someone who meditates on the scriptures day and night. In Hebrew, the word meditate means literally to mutter or speak quietly. The idea is that every day for the rest of your life, you slowly, quietly read the Bible out loud to yourself, and then go talk about it with your friends, pondering the puzzles, making connections, and discovering what it all means. And as you let the Bible interpret itself, something remarkable happens. The Bible starts to read you. Because ultimately, the writers of the Bible want you to adopt this story as your story.
So this ancient Jewish writing style, it must create unique types of narrative and poetry and discourse.
Yes, and we'll explore all of those literary styles starting next with biblical narrative.
And they do a good job. They
So
started out
what's
several
the-
years ago, and they just produced these great thing for schools. So, big words this week. Hermeneutics. Hermeneutic is a fancy word for interpretation. Okay? You interpret everything that you experience, especially when it comes to stories or text or anything. You're putting it through some kind of lens or process. When I'm talking, you put it through your own process of interpretation. Sometimes things are really direct. So if I said, everyone stand up, we're going to walk outside into the hall, that needs less interpretation, probably, than if I told some kind of parable like Jesus did. So or when I sow a seed, the kingdom of God's like this. And you're just like, what? He leaves it hanging. So there's different aspects of interpretation. But if I said, we're all going to stand up and go out into the hall, and you didn't know what hall was, that creates a level of tension in that. Hermeneutics are hard because what we're trying to do is take the world of, we'll say our world, okay, and the world of the text, or the author. And this is, when it comes to the Bible, this is an ancient text, and our life is not ancient anymore. And so we're trying to enter into that world in a way that brings it, as they said, into this world. The problem is that so many times this foreground overshadows the background. When we were doing youth ministry, Scott and I were doing youth ministry, a lot of times we would tell stories, and you tell a Bible story, and then you relate it to teenagers in a modern context. This is like when you're in the cafeteria at your school. This is going on. Imagine this. And there's benefit to that because it brings it into both worlds, but there's also the risk that you lose the original story because you've made it into a modern story. And so for us, we always want to start as much as possible with the world of the text. But the problem is, I went down to a friend's lake house and we stayed, and it got rainy and foggy one day. Do you see this? This is Lake Eufaula from the porch of his house. Can you see the horizon? Well, you think you do. Do you? Or is that just a fog down on the water? Can you imagine being out on a boat and going fast and being out at sea, let's say, not Lake Eufaula, and headed into that? What would that be like? This is a little bit closer view. Can you see the horizon? Where is it? Here's the problem. This is not a clear line. Where does the text end and our world begin? It overlays. And we're always trying to get a broader horizon. Imagine if you lived in a valley, it'd be hard to see the horizon. You go up to a mountaintop, you can see a better view. We're trying to always add things that help us clarify that always foggy horizon. Okay? We do that by studying things. So we believe the Bible is a text. It means we study literature, we study language. It's a historical text, so we study history, and all of that can give us a little bit more clarity on what things mean. Okay? And that's the process. And that process is exegesis. Another big word. Exegesis comes from the idea of reading from. Okay? It's another alternate word is eisegesis. This is the Greek word for into and being. So eisegesis is when you read into the text. That's when I take my world and overlay it to the text and make it totally about what my world is. Exegesis is when I'm trying to find out what's going on with the text first and then apply it to my world. Exegesis is the kind of thing that I think people are intimidated by, because how do you know you'll never know enough, right? Who were the Roman emperors in the time of Jesus? And who were the governors of Syria? And where are these names? It's just hard. It gets overwhelming. I just want to say that you don't have to know everything to start knowing something, right? The first place to start is just read the text for what it says and pay attention to what's going on around it in the language that you know. And then over time, begin learning some other things. Eugene Peterson, in his book, and this is a great book, his book is a great book. It's very inspiring to read the scripture. He's talking about exegesis, and he says, there's this problem. Sometimes we think that what we're looking for is spiritual reading. I don't need exegesis. I don't need to be a scholar. I don't need to learn things. And the Spirit's just going to talk to me through the Bible, which is great. But it's also immature, okay? Because exegesis is not in contrast to spiritual. Exegesis brings 3 dimensions sometimes and color to things that the Spirit can use to heighten the Spirit's voice in us. So he says, so he's using spiritual in quotes, which is that the more spiritual we become, the more care we must give to exegesis. The more mature we become in the Christian faith, the more exegetically rigorous we must become. This is not a task from which we graduate. These words given to us in our scriptures are constantly getting overlaid with personal preferences, cultural assumptions, sin distortions, and ignorant guesses that pollute the text. You know how those trees in my photo were in the foreground? I can't see the whole horizon because there's so many things that are in my life that trim up that view. The pollutants are always in the air, gathering dust on our Bibles, corroding our use of the language, and especially the language of faith. Exegesis is a dust cloth, a scrub brush, and even a Q-tip for keeping the words clean. But exegesis does not mean mastering the text. It means submitting to it as it is given to us. Exegesis doesn't take charge of the text and impose superior knowledge on it. This is not some knowledge quest. It enters the world of the text and lets the text read us. Exegesis is an act of sustained humility, which is great. There is so much about this text that I don't know, that I will never know. Christians keep returning to it with all the help we can get from grammarians and archaeologists and historians and theologians, letting ourselves be formed by it. It's a lifelong journey of this Jewish meditation literature that they talk about. I think sometimes what we want to do is we just want to check things off the list. And this is not about checking things off the list. I don't think about breathing as checking things off the list. It's a way of surviving. And the minute I quit breathing is when I quit surviving. And scripture study is the same way. We lean into it over the long haul. Eugene Peterson wrote another great book, Long Obedience in the Same Direction, right? It's just that way of going. So, and Peterson in his book talks about lectio divina, which is the Latin phrase for divine reading. And something the church has done, especially in the East for a long time, and even in the Catholic, it's Latin, the Catholic Church, but in the Protestant Church, we kind of forgot these kinds of things for a while. And Lectio Divina goes like this. Step one is pretty simple. You read it. Oh, go ahead.
No, I said read the text.
Yeah, read the text. Lectio. Read it. Sit down and be with it. Maybe read it in different ways. Think about it in different ways, which leads to the second step, meditatio. It's just research and reflect. Meditation doesn't just mean doing this, by the way. It doesn't mean think about it. It does mean partly that. But this is the exegesis part too. I'm going to come at this text with every angle I can to try to see it in every way that I can. I'm going to bring every sense of knowledge that I can to the text. I'm going to learn new things so that this text becomes a part of me. In Psalm 1, it says, blessed is the man whose way is not like the wicked, basically. He walks in the way he sits, he stands and he sits, and it says, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in it he meditates day and night. And that word for meditate is like they say, it's like murmuring, but it's murmuring like a dog chewing on a bone. Or maybe a lion chewing on a bone. Eugene Peterson talks about it that way. It's just this continual, right? That's the same kind of word. When we come to the scripture, we gnaw on it. And that's this meditatio part. And then oratio, which is to pray about it. God, show me what you want me to see. Open my eyes to it. And not just in the moment, but maybe like throughout your life in the day. God, remind me of your word. And try to live in the things that God has put in you. And then contemplatio, which is not just that contemplation part. The way that the monks talk about this was putting it into action. But contemplation results in a life change. So if there's something that I have gained, how is it going to transform me? And this is divine reading. This is the way of approaching scripture over the long haul. And this is never, in my opinion, fast. Look, it makes me feel good when people say, man, you just know so much about the Bible or whatever. But here's the thing, I'm 50 years old. I was enamored with the Middle East at the age of 13 when I read a book about the Crusades. So I've been reading about the Middle East since I was a junior high kid. I've loved great stories. I was a Tolkien fan. I love great stories and why they work. Even before I was a Christian, once I became a Christian, all that kind of came together. I've studied it for a long time. I hope that I know something by now, right? It doesn't come quickly. And you have to start where you are. You never compare yourself to something. If I began running for a marathon today, Lord have mercy, I might not ever get there, and I certainly don't want to compare myself to an Olympic athlete or even somebody who's just been running for 5 years. So it's not a comparison game, it's a transformation game that takes place over the long haul. So narrative and stories. Am I going too fast, by the way?
No.
As I'm talking about slowing down, I'm rushing through it all. Here's the cool thing about stories. We love them. And there are some people who are super gifted at telling stories. They can say the most simple story. They can be like, I'm going to tell you how I went to 7-Eleven and bought a bag of chips. And you know those people, they start telling the story just like, tell me more. Oh my God, what happens, And nothing really happens. They just are able to convey a story in a way that's really compelling. That's a gift for some people. Other people craft it and work on it really hard to tell good stories. So the biblical authors are great storytellers. And for some reason, my slide's not updating in front of me. There we go. This is cool because this is, they've done MRI scans of what happens in a brain when somebody's being told a story. And they've compared it with like lecture. Like I was up here just lecturing on facts. And I'm like, well, there are 33% of the Bible's narrative. And right, I'm telling all that. That's engaging a certain part of your brain. But if I told a story, they do MRI scans. This is incredible. When we narrate stories, we have a huge impact. They have a huge impact on our lives. We can pass the feeling that we've experienced to other people too. Doing a research study, when the narrator spoke English, the volunteers understood her story and their brains synchronized. This is incredible. When she had activity in her insula, part of her brain, where emotions are processed, an emotional brain region, the listeners did too. When her frontal cortex lit up, so did theirs. By simply telling a story, the woman can plant ideas, thoughts, and emotions into the listeners' brains. So they're doing these scans on everybody, and the same parts of their brains are firing off as she's telling this story. Her part of the brain, their part of the brain. Norman Neves used to be a pastor at Church of the Servant, and Adrian Cole told me this a long time ago, before I even knew Norman, who was a great preacher. Norman said that when you're preaching and you tell a story, you want to keep it as general as you can so that it connects with the most people. The more specific you get, the less it connects. If I said, I grew up in Kiowa, Oklahoma, I didn't have much. If I said, I grew up in a small town, suddenly everybody who grew up in a small town is like, ding, 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 the emotion that's going on, right? So I created this story to teach about story, and it goes like this. In my backyard when I was growing up, there was this great tree. The perfect kind of tree where the limbs are spaced just right, even for a kid, where you can just reach just a little bit and you can climb so high in that tree that before you know it, you look down and you have that kind of, excuse me, but that pugger moment, that kind of, oh gosh. If you're in the CN Tower in Toronto, they have a glass door in a segment of it. You walk onto that floor and you think, it's no big deal. You step on that floor, you're looking down at skyscrapers, and you think, gosh, and you step back. When you're a kid in this kind of tree, and you look down, and all my friends used to come over to climb in that tree, and it was incredible. You know what I'm talking about, right? The kind of tree. Now, for those of you who know the tree, and I can tell by your eyes, those of you who do, you're thinking about a tree. It's not my tree. Whose tree is it? Your tree, whatever it is, whatever kind of tree it was. And suddenly we're on the same page, even though we're not. I've brought you into my story. I am beginning to shape your reality for you, with you. It can be used to be super manipulative because guess what? There was never a big tree in my backyard. I made that up completely. The tree I'm actually thinking of is my friend John Beaver's tree, which we did climb all the time, but I didn't have it. But with story, I can take you to another reality. It's incredible what stories can do, for good or for ill, what stories can do. Now, another big word. We have a lot of big words today. Epistemology is basically the study of how you know what's real. How do you know what is? Right? Epistemology. It's kind of a weird thing because I can study something, I can experience something, right? I'm gonna put this up here with study. I'm gonna put logic, although this whole thing has its own kind of logic. Or I can believe something. And what's in here, this area in here, however big it is, that's what I believe to be true. Okay? That's my epistemology. That's the way it works. And we can break this. There's other ways to approach epistemology. But what's interesting is if somebody came in and said, hey, have you seen the bird families here today? I'm not birds, I don't know them. Oh yeah, you have to know them. They can fly. I go, what? Right? Somebody says, no, they can fly around, their whole family flies. Like in a plane? No, they got wings, they can fly. Well, in my experience, except for in mythology, I've never seen a person, right, with wings. I've only studied about that. And the truth is it's not going to be lining up. Am I going to believe somebody who comes in and says that? Well, I don't know. It depends on who they are. It might be. The truth is, it would have to be somebody that I really trust, right? If Scott comes in and says, no, they can fly. I'm like, you're pulling my chain, man. What's going on? Like, what are you talking about? He says, I've seen them. If I really believe him, then I might accept it as being true. But if he said, no, come with me, and I go into the sanctuary, and there's this family, and they're flying around wings, suddenly my experience has changed, and what I believe has grown bigger, what I know to be true, right? We're constantly in this thing, in this world, about how do we know what's true or not? Stories bring us into areas of things that we haven't even experienced yet and convince us things are true. Right? I could say down here, we could do a debate about all kinds of things. And you're only going to agree with me if you agree with my points. Probably already. Debates are really for the audience and not between two people, and it's usually echo chambers. Right? But I can tell a story and get you on my page really quick. And I think it's fascinating that most of the Bible is story. It brings us into a world that we have not yet experienced using common things. And I just want to point that out. The key to a good story is tension. The better the story, the more tension is in the story. I got up this morning, I got a bowl, I got the milk out, I got the cereal down, I poured it in the bowl, I got a spoon, I took the bowl, and I ate it. Now, I told that as well as I could. That's not near as great. I got up this morning, I got a bowl of cereal, I got the milk, and I set the cereal on the edge of my couch, and I sat down. And you're already there with me, right? And I've got to be, this didn't happen, by the way, but right, you understand the tension of that creates, the more tension, the better, the more engaging the story. Another way to think about tension is conflict. Good stories often have conflict, either inner or outer conflict. Okay? That's the thing, because conflict or tension moves the story forward. Otherwise, it goes nowhere. The guy got up in the morning, he went to work, he sat at his desk, he did some things, he ate lunch, he sat at his desk, he went home. That didn't move very much, right? He went to work, and he got fired. And all of a sudden, what happens next? And you want that story to move forward. So story arc. This is an interesting thing. We think about ancient cultures as being not sophisticated. The truth is that they thought about these things more than our own culture does. They knew how story worked. And Aristotle says every story has a beginning, middle, and an end. You're like, duh. But what he talks about is it has to have this kind of arc to it. And it kind of works like this. You have the exposition, you have the setting of the scene, right? What's going on? Who's in the story? The complication or the tension. And then that moment where the tension creates, you have to move. Somebody has to change doing what they're doing, right? And by the way, it's not always halfway. It's represented halfway. It can happen early in the movie. What's that Robert Redford movie where his boat gets hit by the barge and he's floating out at sea without power? I can't remember that movie. The barge hitting his boat happens in like the first 5 minutes. And the rest of the movie is him figuring out what to do. And that's the unraveling of the story or the working out of the story. How does he get past the situation? And then you have the ending. Sometimes the ending wraps it up for you. Sometimes it's open for effect. The Bible and most stories, movies that we watch today, actually work like this. Sub-stories, right? My kids are big Marvel movie fans, and every little character has their own little change moment and tension happening. But there's this overarching theme in the story as well. They're woven together. In literary circles, this is called meta-narrative, the one on the bottom. The one big story that binds all of these together is the meta-narrative. And the Bible is like this, especially for Christians, because the New Testament authors are interpreting the Old Testament. And their change point, we know what their change point is, right? What's the change point for New Testament authors? Jesus. Everything in the past is being reinterpreted in light of Jesus. And so there's this arc in this place that it's going, this place that we hope that it goes. And you can see this arc, this New Testament hermeneutic of the Old Testament. So, biblical stories. We're on that on. All right. I'm going to skip over reading these for the sake of time. These will be available. These are different versions of the Samson story that are ancient, but they go through history. So this first one right here is from a Jewish source. They're both from a Jewish source. The second one is from Josephus, and they're retellings of the story of Samson that is the same story, which is this one. And this one is actually the shortest version of this a segment of the Samson story. One, Samson went to Gaza. Excuse me, but this is actually what it says in Hebrew. So there he met a whore and slept with her. The Gazites heard that Samson had come there. So they gathered and lay in ambush for him in the town gate the whole night. So there's the tension. Samson has come to the town. They're wanting to capture him, and they're waiting, right? And they're there the whole night. All night long, they kept whispering to each other. And daylight comes. And by the way, when you read the Bible, it says whisper. It's in your head, right? But Samson lay in bed only until midnight. How long did they stay, by the way? All night. Now we're in the unraveling. There's the tension, there's the change. So they're whispering to each other all night. Right? At midnight, he got up, he grasped the doors to the town gate with the two gateposts and pulled them out along with the bar. And by the way, this would be noisy. This is a comedy sketch, right? And he's tearing out the city gates, right? And he placed them on his shoulders and carried them off to the top of the hill that is near Hebron, which is a ways away. And I killed him. So that's a biblical story. And what you're going to see about the biblical narrative, the biblical narrative is never pious or coy. He spent the night with the whore. That's the biblical story. It's not some elevated language. That word that gets translated ash heap is really like it's the dung heap, the crap pile. Lord, I was on the crap pile. And we can say it in more strong language. Paul says in the New Testament, this isn't even a narrative, but it is. It's kind of Paul's narrative. He says, all these things that I was before Christ, they are rubbish. It's trash. It's the stuff it's translated crap as well. The Bible doesn't clean things up. Those two previous versions that were kind of redos of the story, they clean it up a lot. You can look at this online. It has no difficulty describing Samson, the Danite hero, visiting the fortress. It does not recoil from describing how the spy sent by Joshua went to the house of the harlot Rahab, a good place for picking up local gossip. Only later pious commentators described her as a seller of provisions in some other stories. Certain kinds of, what did she provide? One of the characteristic marks of the biblical storytellers is a certain reticence. There's an austere, spare quality to their stories. They don't give us everything we want in a modern story. They don't tell us much, actually. That's what it said. They don't tell us too much. They leave a lot of blanks in the narration, an implicit invitation to enter the story ourselves, just as we are, and discover for ourselves, this is P.G. Peterson, how we fit into it. The scripture stories do not, like Homer's, court our favor. They're not trying to entertain us. They do not flatter us. They may please us and enchant us. They seek to subject us. And if we refuse to be subjected, we are rebels. I want to say this. I do think that they, and he does too, write entertainingly. But it's not about just making sure that we heard a great story. Nothing comes to us apart from the form of narrative in this case. The Bible, the entire Bible, is relentlessly narratival. And we cannot change or discard the form without changing or distorting the content. This biblical narrative gathers everything into it, providing a beginning and an ending, plot and character development, conflict and resolution. For most of the Christian centuries, attentive readers of the Bible have understood that its many voices and points of view are all contained in the narrative form and are given coherence by it. Fancy language is we're about stories. Our faith is about story, testimony. Instead of attempting to iron out the wrinkles of inconsistency and disharmony, because a good story needs what?
Conflict.
Conflict or tension. And if we're trying to get rid of all the tension, what are we doing to the biblical stories?
Ruining it.
We're making that story about, I got cereal and I ate it, right? That needs to happen. So Adam and Eve are in this perfect creation in chapter 1, and in chapter 2, it tells a different story. It is a different kind of story. Very earthy. And then chapter 3, the snake shows up and throws a complete, and we don't know anything about the snake. There is that, what happened to the snake, right? That's a tension in the story, and we need to not try to iron that out. We have to listen for resonances, echoes, patterns, the swarming complexity of lived truth, not pinned down or labeled facts. History, plot, and scene. The thing is biblical authors are creative in how they put together things. The truth is all history authors are creative in how they do things for the sake of time. Because if I told the story about me fixing cereal this morning, it would actually be way more complex. I took 27 steps down the hall. Right? You have to pick what you're going to leave out and what you're going to tell. That's part of good storytelling. I mentioned before, and I was going to show it another time, in the movie Lincoln, Spielberg's movie Lincoln, he's talking to the Secretary of State. And there's one conversation that takes place over 2 scenes, but it never breaks the conversation. They're in a wagon at first, in a, what do you call it? And a carriage, thank you. And they're in top hats and they're talking about they're setting the scene. Spielberg's using it to set the scene. Then it jumps to a conversation in the White House. And they're still having never a break in the conversation. You don't even notice it when you're watching the movie. If we really did what we do to the Bible with that movie, we'd be like, wait a second. What was the conversation between? I mean, they were in the carriage. Did they walk to the White House? When did they we get over analytical because it's setting the scene. And I think the biblical authors are creative in this too. Okay? So we have that arc. And if you look at the Gospel of Mark, it does this arc just like this. This is the cross. And really this is the resurrection. Except for in the Gospel of Mark, there is no resurrection. Yeah. It leaves it with the tension, which is a great way for telling the story because you know what people were saying at the end of this story. What happened? Which is a great thing to leave with the crowd if you want to give them an answer. Okay? So it starts out here, and the Gospel of Mark makes it very clear who Jesus is at the very beginning. This is the beginning of this good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. Boom. Reader knows, listener knows who he is. And then it spends all this time where everybody knows who Jesus is. If they are outcasts, if they are blind, if they are demons, if they are demonized, they all know who Jesus is. You're the Son of the Most High. You're the Son of the Most High. But his own disciples, the whole time, are like, who is this guy? Who is this guy? How can they not see it? And then Peter here at this place has this declaration at Caesarea Philippi. You are the Messiah, the Son of God. It's like this pinnacle point. This is the change that changes everything. This takes place over this mixed period of time because they never go to Jerusalem. Unlike in the Gospel of John, where they go to Jerusalem all the time. These Jewish guys never go to Jerusalem over a long period of time. So we can't keep track of time, but we think this is about 3 years. Based on the Gospel of John, we think it's about 3 years. And then this period right here takes place over 1 week. And most of it takes place over 2 days, plus the resurrection. Time slows down and stretches out. And to think that Mark's not doing that on purpose is a mistake. Mark's doing it on purpose. He's bringing us into this story. He's got this turning moment. Yes, he's the Messiah. And then so why do they go back to not knowing. A chapter later, they're like, who is this guy? Right? It's a comedy sketch in some ways. And then it ends with an empty tomb and women being told to go tell the disciples that he's risen. Right? Because they don't see Jesus and these women. It's like, and they went, it ends in the middle of a sentence. And they went away afraid and you see. Right? That's creative. Mark wrote this gospel in a way, he probably had all kinds of things he could have done with Jesus' story. But he does it this way for a purpose. And the Old Testament authors do the same thing. When we tell history stories, we pick and choose to create and craft the story to give it the kind of meaning that we want it to have. That's not a bad thing. We all do it. That's good history. Okay? If we told everything, it would be terrible. So things to pay attention to. Repetition. If you hear something over and over, time manipulation like this, if things speed up and slow down, pay attention to that. Note not only what is present, but what might be missing, what's not in the story that should be in the story. Allow for tensions, humor, sarcasm, metaphor. There's a lot of sarcasm in the Bible. Prophets are sarcastic. There's humor in the Bible. Laugh. It's good. What is the change or the turn in the story? Look for that. Ask yourself. My kids and I, we do this. Where was the turn in this movie? Where did it really change? It shapes. It's good to look for. And don't force it in the sense of enjoy it. if you're not getting, don't be like, I gotta get to understand all this, just let that story sit with you a little bit. Pay attention to those forms, look for the sub-stories, what they do, and longer arcs. There are things that happen in the Old Testament in particular, a prophet will come and say something, and it won't be until 5 chapters later, 4 kings later, that it's fulfilled. A larger arc. And then context. I want to show you a little clip as we wrap up about context. Remember that movie, The March of the Penguins? It was in France. It was titled March of the Emperors. Okay. Oh, we don't have the internet, so we're not going to be able to do it. What just happened? Oh, get our settings. Oh, here we go. Here we go. We're back. Oh. It's fine. I think we may have lost our internet. I'm going to show this next week. It won't be as good if I tell it, but I'm going to tell it just because in this commercial about movies, about paying attention, a guy is telling this girl he's having coffee with, I went and saw this, it's in French. He's like, I went and saw this incredible movie, March of the Emperors. And it's showing what she's thinking in her head. And it shows this emperor, a Napoleon-like guy, step up, right? And they are in the Antarctic. And she's like, she has to scratch it because he was in France. Now he's in this frozen tundra. And it was fantastic because as they migrated from one place to another, and it showed this line of emperors, and then they were attacked by these seals. And she's like, what? And he said this most moving moment was when they traded their eggs with each other. And so these emperors are handing these eggs around, right? I'm sorry about this one, but and then they all began to have sexual relations with each other. And she's like, what? Right? Context matters, right? Pay attention. Don't read something into a story that's not there, and check your assumptions, especially if you've been in the church for a long time. Because it's easy to read into things that we've been taught, and sometimes we've been taught to read stories wrong. So always let the scripture surprise you. See the thing that you couldn't see before. Look for it. I'm going to say look for it because you're going to find it. It's going to be there. And when you find those moments, it's like, oh, wow, that's an opening moment. But enter into the story and enjoy it because we're people of story. And don't let it be bland to you. So narrative and story is the most part about it. And I've got this good worship. Bill's going to give us who's worked hard on slides this morning. Let's pray. Oh, God, we thank you that you are God who speaks. God, you are the best storyteller of all times. We are made for stories because you tell stories. And your greatest story is the story of your son and the change that happened because of him on the cross. And he's given you his life. And we look forward to the next change that happens when all of history changes. Until then, let us be people who live out this story, and let's be an extension of the story of the Bible that we've already put together. We thank you for the chance. We thank you for the grace. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Well, thank you. We got it all in time except for one video.
I think
Dang it.
maybe we're gonna get together.
I love it.
So I brought them all.
Stop playing.
That's
They
beautiful.
are still. Yeah, let's try that. One more step. Go home.
Oh, wait, this isn't a touch screen. I'm sitting there touching the screen.
Like a little kid.
Good job this morning.
Thank you.